Alrighty. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our weekly market overview, where we try to take a look at our market here to see if we can gauge some type of pathing or direction that may be taking place. Quick disclaimer: anything you see in this video is not financial advice; it's merely for educational purposes. And with that, let's get started. Alrighty. First and foremost, first thing we always like to look at is our weekly candle here. Starting off with our weekly candle, just making sure everyone sees the screen. It's usually when I first open the software, it starts to get a
We
little
can see.
weird. You can see it? Okay, perfect.
Yep.
All right. So, first thing we see here on our weekly is we do have a little bit of a longer lower wick, and then we do have an upper wick. One thing that's suggesting to me is on the lower bounds of our range here from last week's range, we have buyers stepping in pretty heavily, kind of defending price action over this 200 moving day average right now. We did not get a full break under this week. We didn't even really test it much. All we had was our 20 here starting to catch up. Um, Although our 20 is generally it's pretty bullish when our 20 starts to cross over our 200 here. But one thing that we want to be cautious on is the moment we have this 20 cross, typically what we could have happen is we could have a pullback and we start to reject the 20 moving forward, and then we just and pretty much continue our bear cycle. So our main thing here is going to be watching. You can't see it yet, but when I go into the lower time frame, we're going to be able to see our 5, which is our yellow line here. A main thing is being able to hug, if not continue price action over it for the time being. um Really what you want to see is if our 20 starts to catch up here, even if we break below it, we want to see, this is on the weekly, but on the daily is really what we're looking at. All right, we want to see our 20 start to catch up here. Eventually you wanted to see it turn into some type of short-term resistance, right? And then that's where our key inflection point is going to be, whether that short-term resistance breaks us back under the 200, or that short-term resistance kind of keeps us consolidated here until we can finally get the break over it. um so that's one thing I'm going to be looking at right now. We finally have that crossover, so we're kind of approaching that apex point right now, where either we have continued consolidation over it. Eventually we want to start seeing it cross above price action and become our short-term resistance. Why do you want that? It kind of gives us a better mid to long term price action trend in a way. Basically, our 5 days is going to be our short term, right? So our 5 day, we can kind of jump over it quite often, right? Depending on if we have a lot of catalysts or we just happen to have a few days of positive momentum, right? Our 20 day on our daily is going to be fairly important, because then we're going to have pretty much 20 of these 20 daily candles where we're maintaining price action over it. Essentially, you want to see that hold for more of a medium to longer term trend, right? But usually when our 20 starts to catch up, our 20 starts to catch up and our 200 here is, we're pinned between it here like this. Any failures at the 20 is going to give us a nice push direct underneath our 200. It most likely will go like butter, and then our only line of defense is around this 560 area, um, which is still healthy. It could still be a decent higher low off of this trend here. and we can still continue. Could be a nice solid bounce point as well. So that's one thing I'm going to be looking at this week to see how we kind of react with the 20 finally catching up here, right? Does it turn into some type of support or short-term resistance? And then if it does turn into resistance, do we lose that um 200 day as our support? Um, then we can look towards those retests of the 560s area, which I think is really healthy for our trend here, right? So going back to the daily, we do our weekly here. We don't really have too much of a clear rejection here just yet. And just we had some news catalysts that week that kind of pushed us down here. So we didn't really hit like necessarily a wall for me. As we were looking at last week, oh, delete that again. As we were looking at last week, we kind of had buyers exhaust near the top here. We didn't really get a clear rejection. That's something we were looking at last week. And this week, again, right? Although it's a lower low, it's also a lower high, right? So essentially, when we have lower lows and lower highs, what do we have? We have price starting to compress in our range for some type of expansion to the downside or to the upside, right? But putting that aside, we don't necessarily have a rejection near the upper bounds of our range, right? We're still in the last 2 weeks of price action here. No clear rejection. We last week we had buyers exhausted, not really necessarily a rejection. So to see a clear rejection, we would want to see either we test these highs and start to flush underneath that, or we have a break and we test slightly above, right? Like five, I believe this is 595. So let's say 596, 597. I know we had it, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was an overnight price action up there, but we didn't really have it actually taking place during market hours. So on a push towards that 596, 597 area and then reject, that would be a clear rejection, meaning that buyers aren't unable to push us higher and they're unable to break uh, above this previous day's resistance, right? So we didn't necessarily, like I said, we didn't have any rejections last week. So if we do want to have some type of rejection of the overhead range here, we need to either reject on last week's highs, or not last week's, the week before's highs, or we create a new high and then get some type of large rejection, right? We don't really have anything like that happening here. All we have is a nice large lower wick here, showing buyers are stepping in when needed, and they're defending this line, pretty much defending us over this 200-day moving average, right? So they're defending us 3 days in a row, buyers refusing to let us fail this trend for now. um, but we do not have any sort of resistance for where sellers can aggressively start to take place, right? Any selling that we've had has been either a pullback off of highs or some type of catalyst that has pulled us back. We haven't had a clear rejection and price action just yet, right? You could look at any levels and you say it tapped 589 4 times, 590, whatever level you have. You can say it tapped it multiple times and fell down, but in reality, it was some news based catalyst or a pullback off of the highs that caused us to have a deeper pullback. We didn't necessarily have a strong rejection of the high, right? Like you can take a look just a little bits ago, right, in February, right here. If we look right here, where we're struggling to break above here, we have a slight rejection here. We test this range again, rejecting this range. We test this range, reject again. Eventually, we have price action that starts to consolidate in this range. Essentially, buyers and sellers are building up some confidence, building up the range to either test this upper bounds or break out for the lower bounds here. And what do we have? We have one week where we kind of reject in the same area, but we still maintain price action above the medium here, right? Then eventually we have a look above and reject a range above, right? and then everything else following this is just catalyst on the way down, right? Um, whatever catalyst pushes us down, right? This is the tariff news, right? But essentially, the moment we broke out of that compression there, or we start to create a little bit of some sort of compression like this, where we're rejecting a range, rejecting a range, rejecting a range, consolidating within that range, and eventually get a clear rejection to go higher, right? So we haven't gotten that just yet. All we're doing is buyers are not able to step in, right? Just like here, we're not having buyers step in with confidence just yet. Part of that could be any news catalyst. I'm sure tariffs has a very strong role in this, um, but we still do not have that strong rejection, right? That's what we're looking for. So we kind of have this consolidation in the past 2 weeks of price action. We're kind of in the mid bounds here. So I would like to see we either get some break above here. That's actually where our, let's go to our daily here. It's actually where our strong and weak pivotal points are here, right? So essentially, if I start seeing some breaks under 575 or break above 585, um, that's essentially where our momentum is going to take us, right? So our weak breaking our weak pivotal point is going to give us a flush towards the lower ends here. That 560 area, 561 that I was looking for kind of a trend correction, right? We get the gap to fill. Um, the fear from the buyers are gone. Then we have sellers starting to gain confidence because we filled the gap, and then create a bounce off of here to continue the trend. It would not invalidate our uptrend that we're in, right? We can afford a lower high around this 561 area. And then as far as our 595 here, this is exactly what I was talking about, where we kind of stalled out at the top, right? We didn't have any rejections anywhere above, right? This is just essentially a wall that was hit right here. We didn't have any rejections. If you see a candle like that without any upper wick here, and we kind of just have a long push down here. Essentially, what that means is buyers essentially hit a wall. They didn't necessarily reject anything, there just weren't any new buyers stepping in, and sellers had orders right here, right? That's essentially what it is. And then eventually buyers step back in over the five. So we don't necessarily have um, a rejection to go higher. We just have exhaustion. I know it's a lower high here, but that still does not invalidate our trend just yet. Especially like I said, we're over the five here, so I'm looking for this 595, and we can start to recapture it, especially 590, 590, 589 area. If we can have price action maintain over this, even if we have a little bit of a luck below and we keep tapping it, all we're looking for is this 595 to break through with some type of confidence. And I do not think 600 is out of the way if we can get 595 to be recaptured with some decent volume. And like I said, for the lower bounds here, that 575 here, if we start losing it with some confidence as well, our target's going to be that 560 area, 561 area. So this is why I usually have our strong pivotal points here, and they kind of fall perfectly within our range here, right? Our last 2 weeks of range. And aside from just that, they're also pretty large volume notes on our weekly or daily time frame, and significant areas of value. So if we start seeing this break underneath here, that's going to give us that push towards here. Break above here is going to give us the test towards 600 here. And who knows, if we get above 600, we can possibly shoot up towards 603. 603 is a quick run after 600. So that's if we do get 600 here, but we need to maintain price action above this 589, 590 area. Hold, right? Any sort of pullback can reclaim it and settle, but we cannot have any rejections that are taking place around the 590 area. And then quickly here on our daily, once again, we do have these long lower wicks here showing me that buyers are again rejecting any price action here, right? We break below the 5 is pretty much accelerated. That's why we have these long wicks. We have accelerated price action the moment we break the 5, and buyers step in when needed the most, and just make sure that we are holding over the 5 here, our 5-day moving average, our current trend structure. So once again, we have rejections to go lower, rejections to go lower. This is our last 4 days of price action. Even here, when we tested the highs and had some type of pullback, I believe this is off of the opening of Nvidia's earnings, right? We were on highs. So even with this pullback, we still defended this 5-day moving average. And again, we're defending the 5-day moving average, and kind of falls in line with our major pivot here. Is going to be our 590.75 or 590 area. So we can start to have some type of volume that pushes us through to give us that break over the 595. We can definitely test those highs here. You can see how it acts very pivotal, right? We have price action that kind of flows through this 590 area. So this is going to be our major thing. If you do want to trade anything short term or any quick scalp, this 590.75 area is going to be a really key inflection point, especially 589. Essentially a break underneath there, you can look for a short-term scalp to the downside. A break above, you can look for a short-term scalp to the upside. It's been our major pivotal point for the last 2 weeks now. So be on the lookout for that. Like I said, 595 is going to be our clean break towards the upside. And once again, all the notes that for this live I did post in my channel. I actually posted them already. So if you guys want to take a look after the live, whether you're going to rewatch it or just kind of look at the notes to see if you can piece it together, it will be in my channel. All right, so it's a lot of chaos here. Let's get rid of this. Okay, so for our pathing here, I try to keep it as simple as possible because we still have a little bit here to build out. um Kind of, if you notice, we're kind of settling in this range right here. So we still have a little bit of price action to help push us in a direction. But for now, what I'm looking at, let's look at the downside first. What I'm looking at first is going to be this trend here. I'm looking to see if we can build out a head and shoulders right here. That's going to correspond with the continuous rejection here of our pink channel. So long as we continue to sell in this channel, this yellow trend channel here is essentially going to be short-term resistance and support. That tends to be what these channels hold, right? So if you notice, we have consolidations inside of these areas here, right? And then once we have a break of it, we have some large downside. So once again, especially, and you can look over here, you can look over here. Essentially, every time we have a break of these yellow trend lines, we do have some aggressive selling, or vice versa, where we have some aggressive buying right over it. So what I'm looking for is to see if we have some type of selling that maintains price action in this range here. We do not break out, um we do not maintain price action inside this trend here. We have an uptrend that started to build out towards the end of last week, the end of the day, towards the end of the week. We had a green buying structure here, which is basically strong continuation and price action with nice volume, decent momentum. So we're in that right now. Essentially, what I'm going to be looking for is to see if we can have a break out of here and maintain price action within our trend here, our pink trend. Kind of, this is essentially slow, methodical pullbacks in price action. So a larger term pullback here, you'll see that when I draw out my daily trends, you'll see I tend to have these yellow or blue, dark blue lines that are going to be pretty much large in range. And essentially, that's going to be corresponding with this 30-minute structure here, looking to see if we can have a head and shoulders build out. So I want to see some price action that kind of consolidates within this upper bounds resistance and support. In this range here, it's going to correspond with our 20-day catching up and kind of correspond with what we were saying before, right? Whether we have some type of support that maintains here or we have our 20-day turn to our short-term resistance, then we can have that retest of the 200 and decide if we want to build some more liquidity towards the lower bounds near this 560 area. um and at that point, do we decide, do we want to continue going down, or do we just grab that liquidity there and have some type of catalyst that pushes us up right back? We do have a lower high around that 561 I mentioned last week, um, where we can actually continue on uptrend. It actually would be fairly healthy to have that pullback. We'd be able to fill majority of this gap here, and then we would have no problems with any gaps that we're going to be hesitating over, especially if we start recapturing the 200. No major gaps are going to be there. We just have these short-term gaps, which would get filled and immediately we have a gap and go, right? So these short-term gaps aren't really the major worry here. It's going to be these larger gaps in price action that kind of creates a little bit of hesitation. But like I said, gap and goes are possible. We can also have a gap fill and fade, but essentially, once we have this 200 or 20-day catch up here, it's going to be important because then we can decide whether we have support here, and then as I mentioned before, I want to see the 20-day become some type of short-term resistance, right? So if we have the 20-day catch up, let's say somewhere around here, mid-June, and that turns into resistance, that would be ideal for a retest of the 590s to push us up towards the 600. So either we have that resistance at the 20 towards the upper bounds here, then this 595 here where we struggled, because we struggled here for a little bit here, we have consolidation here. Our 20-day is going to be hovering there for a little bit as price action pushes up. So be on the lookout for that. Essentially, I'm going to clear the drawings real quick here. Essentially, what I was looking at one more time to draw it out for you guys to see if we have selling that takes place and maintains price action inside of here, which would allow us to get our right shoulder of our head and shoulders here. And as far as our upside, not too much different from last week. Last week, we were looking to see if we can have a break out of our yellow trend here. And we in fact gapped up over it and maintain price action inside of here. So last week, what I was looking at was what other color do I have? Pink, I guess. So pink will be these light blue channels here. We're looking at this last week to see if we can build up some liquidity in this range. So any price action that kind of follows in this trend here where we have selling that's kind of slow, methodical inside of our blue trend lines here is inherently bullish. As you see here, once we have the push down, grab the liquidity and pushed up. Again, we're right here, consolidated, pushed up. This is where we bounce. Once we have the flushes underneath, that's when it starts to get aggressive, but that was underneath our yellow trend here. So essentially what we were looking at last week was we wanted to see an inverse that pulled that kind of took place like sort of like this, to push us out of range, where we were looking for it a little bit lower for like a short term one around this range to see if we can get something like this. That's specifically what we were looking at last week. We also mentioned that there is a larger one that we could be possibly having taking place here, something like this. So we're actually in the works of doing that. So what I'm looking at is to see if we can have continuation let's do, I guess, blue here, right? Or green. Let's do green. So green is our head, our shoulder. It's right here. Want to see some continuation inside of this green here. I'm going to be following it along and at open to see if we continue inside of this green structure here. If not, we could have some type of slower buying that takes place. Something that looks sort of like this, where we continue to maintain price action here, and the break's going to be the break over this trend here and recapture of that 595, essentially what we were looking at before. So the completion of that inverse is going to be a break out of our trend here, our downwards trend line here, our blue line here. Essentially what that is liquidity being built. Right now we have continued rejection, struggle to break above. All right, so this is our pretty much our could say our bearish liquidity, where bears are basically stepping up right there. And we also have our bullish liquidity right here where we're trapping the bears. So we're still sitting in between both of those trends here. But I do want to see a break here to create that inverse would be break out of here, retest that 595. We have some type of pullback, something not too crazy. I would be looking out to see if I get another one of these trend lines that take place here, more of a compressed pullback. When I see something like that take place, um, for us to maintain price action, as long as we hold over this area, which is essentially our 590 area. So a retest of our 595, slight pullback, build up some liquidity, and then push towards the upside. That's going to be the completion here. You don't want to just, I mean, we more than likely can still follow here. That wouldn't invalidate the trend. I would probably have to wait for a 595 break for the continued follow through. Basically, what I'm saying is to have our inverse here. If you want our follow through to just be a crazy bull run straight through, 595 breaks going to be the key here to make sure that that's actually taking place. Otherwise, something a more healthy inverse would definitely be a push up, and we break out of these green buying here. So essentially, we have a push here, a break out of that, maintaining price action over that 590 589 area, retest the 595, and we have a breakout. And we would need the breakout of this right here as well, because this can be our short-term resistance. But that's essentially where our right shoulder is sitting, is the break out of this trend here. So not sure if the break happens here, or if we have a break here and then the break happens here. But your major thing is going to be looking to see if this trend breaks and we have a clean break out of this. This is our short-term resistance. This is going to maintain our bullish price action, so the break out of that's going to be pretty intense. So that's what I'll be looking for this week, for that break out of that 595. This is essentially what's going to give us that right shoulder of our inverse head and shoulders here. It's that 595. That's going to be the completion, whether we have some type of pullback or we have some straight follow through. So be on the lookout for that. Uh, and then last week we were looking at 585. That was our key inflection point as well. Just quickly going to go through that here. If you look right here, I mentioned that 585, 584, 45, 585 last week was going to be a really key pivot point here. If we do have any sort of breakdowns, that's what's going to give us that fill or continue towards the downside. Um, Throughout the whole week, we pretty much started in this range, pull back. Once again, we're just maintaining price action over this 585 here. So if you were rushing to short, like I mentioned throughout the entire week, last week was this 585 is going to be your key inflection point for any downside, as well as a retest of our 591 595 was also fairly imminent if we can recapture the 5-day moving average. You can look back on our last week's video and we can see that taking place here. We do not have that break of the 585. We did have the retest of this 591 area, did unfortunately not have a strong follow through. The only follow through we had right here was essentially on Nvidia's earnings that kind of just pushed us back into the range. So it really wasn't much liquidity to be built there. Kind of opened up a little bit higher in range, but we're starting to build up that liquidity here. Stopping at that 591, 590 area here. So I want to see how we have some liquidity that builds up here. Even if right now we have futures pulling back quite a bit, it's not too terrible. But as long as we're maintaining price action here, this yellow trend line not only acts as our support and not only acts as a trend, but it's also essentially our support and resistance here for the short term, right? Until we have a break and expansion of range. So we had that last week towards the end of the week, and that gave us that expansion. Buyer stepped in once again, broke us back into the range here. So again, we're still in that same place. Do we have the breakout here or the break below here to expand our range? Essentially, we're consolidating within this yellow trend for the time being. Okay. Any questions from anybody else? I'm gonna go through our QQQ and our IWM. Specifically, I'm gonna be honest. QQQ and IWM, I don't have any major pathing. I'm essentially just gonna be focusing on the trend line, similar to SPY, but slightly different. I'll go through it with you guys here quickly, but I don't have any major pathing on that. Unfortunately, I do have levels that I'm essentially watching out for IWM and QQQ. So for our QQQ chart, first first and foremost on our weekly, what we see is here we have a higher low and higher high in our trend structure here. Um, that right there is inherently a slightly bullish. Especially if we're maintaining price action over the 20 and the 200 here. If you noticed, our 20 on QQQ has caught up much faster as opposed to SPY has a slight break. QQQ has a pretty clean break that's kind of hovering near price action. So now I would love to see this become that support as we start to push through, eventually turn into short-term resistance to have us get that breakthrough and breakout. So QQQ is getting a little bit closer to testing whether we have that 20-day turn into resistance to break us forward or 20-day turn into resistance to break us down. QQQ's allowing that, I guess you can say, it to happen a little bit faster. As far as our candle here, I do see a little bit of rejection above here. This is what I was mentioning on SPY, right? Where we have QQQ, I mentioned last week, there was a slight rejection in this range here, right? Our midpoint of our range, our pivot here, essentially my level is 521.75, I want to say. I'll go through the levels in a second. I believe it's 521.75 or 521.25, I guess this area. I'll go through it in a second, but essentially we have that rejection right here in the center point of a range. Our highest volume note within this structure here. So we did have a rejection here last week. This week we did have some follow through that allowed us to get a cleaner rejection here at this 526 area. So we are having some early signs of rejections here on QQQ, right? Buyers are stepping in when needed, but they do not have as much conviction as SPY, where we have these longer wicks that are defending it much stronger. So right now, what I'm just looking at is to see if we have any price action that's at least at bare minimum gonna hold us over the 20. That's the major thing I'm looking at, is to see if we have price action over the 20. I don't want to see some failures of the 20-day moving average, daily moving average. Right now, all we have is some rejection in the upper bounds of the range. Buyers are not getting the follow through. Um, and as far as what I was comparing with SPY, right? SPY just kind of hit a wall as opposed to create a higher low or a higher high and then reject, right? SPY didn't even really get to a new high, right? SPY had a wick like this and then a smaller wick here. So we didn't even get to test the highs or even reject at a higher point. QQQ did get that. We had rejection in the midpoint of our range here, right? This is our stall, rejection of the range. Buyers stepped in and we still rejected to go higher within that range. So our major thing is going to be our 20-day holding up price action here. Go to the daily for a second, and you see our 5-day is currently what has been holding us up for the last few days, right? We only have a few days of price action. So if we had a fifth day of last week, more than likely we could have had some type of price action underneath our 5-day to create a newer trend in our 5-day. Currently, our 5-day is using, what happened to my drawing tool? Disappear? Okay, well, I guess it disappeared. So essentially, our 5-day is measuring price action from these last 5 days. So we didn't really get a real test of the 5-day. All we had was price action that held above here. And that's why my major thing is going to be looking at to see if we have our test of the 20-day. You can see our expected low for the week is right around that 507 area, which is essentially where that 20-day is. So we can get a retest here. And then as long as we have price action that supports, that would be healthy. That's what I'm going to be looking at this week. For our daily candle, once again, you can see right here, we do have a little bit of a rejection here where we had buyers weakening the week prior. We have a push through, a follow through, and strong rejections here. The only thing that was defended was buyers did not want to lose the 5-day trend just yet. After we filled that gap, that was essentially the point where sellers could, I would say, start to close their positions, right? If you're gonna short the stock, you at least want to see, once you see the gap fill, that's when you're going to be a little bit more cautious in deciding whether you want to continue to short this or does buyers step in heavily. And in this case, you can see once we had that gap fill, we did have buyers that pushed us back into the 5-day moving average. Let's go to our trend here. As far as pathing, like I said, I do not have any major pathing for IW for QQQ. What I'm looking essentially for is one, that test of the 200, the 20-day. I'm sorry, the green here, our 20-day. That's my major thing I want to see, is whether we have a catch up and test or we have a push down and test. Um, my major thing here is, oh man, it's so weird to not have my drawing tool. Like I'm stuck on my screen, but it's not moving. Okay. Anyways, what I want to see is selling that takes place. Either we have selling that takes place inside of this pink trend here. That's going to be essentially buyers that are going to be building up some liquidity here, but it's going to help us guide for our short term pullback as well. It's going to help guide us for any bear trend that's going to be taking place for the time being. So, what I want to see is some selling that takes place within this channel. Like I said, once we have the breakout of our orange trend line here, right? This is our our buying trend here. The break out of here, which kind of corresponds with our 515 area I mentioned last week, as well as this week. I'll mention it again, especially in my my notes here. You'll see that this area essentially is our range for QQQ, where we're consolidating this range. We're consolidating once again in this range. Usually, tech gives us some exponential moves, so it's quite interesting to see us consolidate in a range here. So what I do want to see is a break that breaks us out of our yellow or orange trend line here. That would correspond with our 5 day turning into a turning into some type of resistance right here. Our 5 day, as long as we continue in this trend, our 5 day will be that resistance that'll keep pushing us down towards the lower bounds of our range here. So that's what I'll be looking for. If we do have some type of accelerated downtrends, I would start to look to see if I can identify any strong trend that's going to help push us towards the downside. We just do not have that as of yet, but I want to see whether we have some selling that takes place within that pink trend line, or do we have some type of selling that takes place inside of this light blue trend here, which is more bullish than it which is a stronger bullish trend here. Essentially, what I want to see is if we have our yellow trend here, right? Remember, our yellow trend is our strong resistances and supports, where we have a lot of volume building up in a range. If you notice, this is one whole days of price action that maintain here. One whole days of price action is millions of dollars of volume within a range. So this is a fairly decent trend structure for support that we can look at. So I want to see if we want to hold up inside of that trend here. um, we've already broken out of the blue here, which is our first step in the bullish trend. So I want to start seeing if we can maintain price action inside of this green buying continuation, get a retest towards this trend line where we previously had a resistance. That's where we get this pullback support. If you look at my notes, I'll say that 521.25 area, I want to see build up some volume. So if we do have a rejection here, start to build volume within this range. As long as we're over our yellow here, then we get a clean break out of. I wish my drawing tool worked because it looks terrible. But essentially, a break out of our 521 is going to give us a nice push towards the upside. We take out these highs here at the 526.50 ish area. 530s is pretty much your next target on QQQ. It's the next resistance in our trend here. It is also our expected range here. Our expected range is 530 and 507. Essentially, this is our longer term resistance on QQQ. So we have some slight resistances here near the midpoint. Or you can, I guess you can say, it's our POC within this range here, point of control in this range. Have a slight rejection. We have buyers that are not able to follow through, but your clean cut rejection, your major resistance is going to be that 530. So if we can get a push towards that area here and get a clean rejection, that would be um ideal for a lower high setup on the a lower high setup on the weekly. Let's go to the weekly. That would be ideal for a lower high setup on the weekly, where we have a push through reject around this area. Then we can start a downtrend towards that 200-day moving average reclaim, and then our uptrend continues. And that essentially gives us that lower high, and that's where I have that SPY 560 area, where we can have a pullback towards there and maintain the structure of our weekly trend. For QQQ, that's essentially what I'm looking at. I want to see that 530 area act as some type of resistance. and then give us that pullback towards the 200. I wouldn't want that pullback to happen just so soon, because then it would essentially invalidate our any structure, and it'll just be some type of news catalyst that would either push us down or push us up. As far as structure goes, we're still structurally sound, so I would like to see an overhead resistance first, that basically either breaks us out of our range. Here's our major range once again, that 521.75 on QQQ and that 515 area. This is essentially your major range. So if you want to just clean cut long over this and short under this, you can also do that. Just be, I would say, cautious on your managing your risks. But essentially, this is our range consolidation. I want to see a break out of here, get a resistance here, or a break underneath, and get some type of support near the 500 or the 200 or the 20-day, and then get us a continuation structure like that, or we have a breakdown, retest that range, and then maintain our uptrend. Right, we can afford a higher low that is fairly deep, in this lower bounds of this range, this 490 low, mid to low 490s. We can afford that lower high in our trend to maintain price action towards the upside on our weekly structure. Once again, all the notes are going to be there in my channel there. I wish I could figure out why this isn't working. See if I can reopen it here. Okay. Quickly for IWM, like I said, I do not have any major structures building out for IWM. In fact, I am fairly neutral on IWM. Don't have any major direction on IWM. You could see that just based on our weekly candle here, where we have a lower wick, upper wick, and a small body candle. That's essentially indecision, right? So we don't have any rejection up above, and we don't have any rejections down below, right? This is, could just look at last week's range as, you could say, short-term resistance and support, right? This is our range that we need to break out of, and we have an inside body candle, um inside that range, smaller body, upper wicks, indecision, right? Lack of momentum towards any pushes up and lack of momentum for any pushes down. IWM has essentially stalled, right? We don't have any clear direction for buyers or sellers. Essentially, what's happening is we're going day by day based on catalysts, based on levels, um, or any unusual activity and flow, right? We don't have any clear direction yet on IWM. And you could say there's a slight uptrend that we have taking place here, right? Where we're pushing up towards the upside. But as long as we're underneath that 200-day, it's still far underperforming as opposed to SPY and QQQ. So we're still pretty much underperforming on IWM severely, right? And we're still resistance towards the midpoint of the range as opposed to QQQ and and SPY, where we're kind of testing the upper bounds of our range. We're pretty far away from that, right? We need to have some price action that breaks us back into that 215 area, and then we can look some for some rejections. Maybe this 230 will be a strong rejection, and then our 240s. But we're just not there yet. And with this weekly candle, you can see it's just kind of an indecision. Further, to add to that point, right? We have the 20-day that's starting to compress within our 5-day, right? So we have this compression and range. Our moving averages aren't expanding, right? So with SPY and QQQ, you have 5-day that looks like this, a 20-day that looks like that. Your 200-day is starting to, you know, curl up a little bit, but IWM, we don't have that, right? We have our 5-day not really being able to have any follow through, right, for the upside. Here where we have essentially where we're buyers are stepping in above the 5 day where we're starting to maintain some bullish price action here. We don't necessarily have any major rejections. We just have a complete slowdown and momentum. Um, Once we break underneath that 5 day, we had that 20-day retest. Then our this week we of course gapped up, so everything else gapped up. We maintained price action over the 5 day here, and our 20-day wasn't that far away. So now if I get rid of all these lines, you can kind of see that we're compressing right between the 5 day and the 20-day. Essentially on Friday, this was the short-term resistance and support for IWM, which is pretty interesting to say because that just shows how indecisive all of these moves up has been, right? We don't have any buyers stepping in with confidence. We don't have any sellers stepping in with confidence. And last week I was identified a wedge that was building out for IWM. And once again, this week we're still in that type of wedge that's playing out here. I'm going to go in the week, go into our pathing here. And like I said, I don't have any major pathing. I'm just looking to identify our wedge that is building out with IWM to see if we can get a break here to create some type of momentum. So essentially what I have right now is our wedge is going to be this trend here, and our base is going to be right. Our base is going to be right here. Essentially, our trend here, you can see it's easier to see on IWM than it is with QQQ and SMI. So it's kind of interesting to see it actually take place here, which is what I essentially do with my trend line. So it's quite interesting to see here. Our 20-day moving average is, if you notice, is following inside of this channel here, right? Our short term, um, pretty much our resistance and support channel, right? Where we have a range bound price action, right? So for quite some weeks now, I've had this here, few weeks now. The only thing I did was add this line here. But essentially the 20-day was following in this channel for quite some time now. So now we have the 20-day essentially um following in this channel, right? It's having some short-term resistance and supplies. Our moving average can also help us guide um help guide us in how a trend could build out, right? So with the yellow trend lines, it always is some type of resistance consolidation, lack of range expansion. Think of the yellow trend lines of like a lack of expansion of range, right? We're just compressing in a range. And of course, I know some of you recognize the light blue here, right? Which is basically our bullish selling, right? It's controlled selling by the bulls. They want to buy as low as possible to push it right back up, right? Or they're either hedging against their position, right? Essentially they're selling, they're selling puts, or they're taking puts to basically hedge against their position for their long-term bullish move, right? So we're following down inside of this teal, you could say teal light blue channel here, which is essentially bulls still in control. And if you look, what do you notice here within that, right? I'm going to draw it out one more time. Our wedge here for IWM. This is going to give us that expansion of range. That's what you're going to be looking for this week, essentially. Bring us towards the lows or bring us towards our highs here. Um, but essentially, we have our 5 day moving average following inside of this bullish pullback trend, right? Notice that it's continuing to maintain price action here in within this range, right? That's essentially what's giving us this, right? We have this V-shaped recovery, and if you look at the weekly, I was saying it looks like nothing's happening, right? There's no direction. On the weekly, it looks like there's not much direction that's taking place, but if you look down on a lower time frame, you see here that buyers are still in control of price action for now, right? They're still in control of any selling that's taking place, right? As soon as we get towards the lower bounds here, we push up. Again, they're controlling the selling in this channel here, and they step in when they um once we start testing the 5 day or the lower bounds of our trend here. You can see that um fairly clearly, and we do have, now we're at the pinnacle where we have our 20-day catching up, which is where our bearish liquidity is going to be, right? That's building out within our 20-day. We had that retest here. So we're sitting in between those this wedge here, essentially, where buyers are going to try to step up to break us out of our current um controlled selling, or are sellers gonna step in and give us the catalyst that we need to break out of this wedge. So that's essentially what I'm looking at for IWM. Major thing, I'll do it one last time for you guys. Essentially, this is what I'm looking at. Any price action to break above or break out is the major goal here, right? With our 20-day and our 5-day compressing, it's going to give us a nice push if we do get this break. It's going to give us an accelerated move. So that's what I'm looking for. For IWM, it kind of has been difficult to see any true direction, and that's clear with us not having buyers step in strongly, but they're still in control. And then now we have sellers starting to creep in. This is where we get that expansion. Do we break out of this range? Essentially, is what I'm looking at for IWM. Ooh, all right. And with that, that about wraps it up for me. I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording now.